Trebizond concentration camp, 1944. All right, guys, we're heading into a new section of the story. More crazy and interesting things happen to Yannick. Chapter 14. Our job was to move a pile of rocks. They were big rocks, and it was a big pile. The rocks were heavy and rough, and we were given no wheelbarrows or gloves. The rocks had to be moved from one side of the assembly field to the other, and the Nazis yelled at us and beat us if we were too slow or if they thought that we were carrying a rock that was too small for us. All right, guys, let's see what an assembly field would be like where they would stand for roll call. So without me looking it up, I'm just going to tell you. I put my arms around another stone and lifted my back, crying out in pain. The rock tore and scraped at my skin as I cradled it to my chest and staggered across the yard to dump it in a new pile. Then I did it again and again. One of the other men stumbled and collapsed, and the guards fell on him with sticks and clubs. I hefted another rock and kept working while I tried not to let the Nazis see how afraid I was. And guys, when he says fell on him, that doesn't mean they tripped and fell on him. It means they just all lunged on him at once like a football pile up, only they had clubs and they were just ganging up on him and beating on him. That's what he's talking about when he says fell on him. They were like Ammengoth's dogs. They could smell fear on you, and they liked nothing better than to attack when you were at your weakest. By midday, my arms and hands and chest were so raw and bruised, I couldn't have gone on. But by then, we were finished. I would have dropped to the ground, but I knew I would just be beaten for it. So I stood with the others, wobbling on my shaking legs, while I waited for the guards to tell us what new task awaited us. "Good," said the SS officer in charge of us. "Now, move it back." I blinked stupidly, not understanding at first. We had just worked all morning to move this pile of stones across the camp, and now the Nazis were changing their minds? The other prisoners and I looked at one another to see if we had heard right. "I said move this pile back to where it was," the SS officer yelled. He moved through our group, hitting us with a stick until we moved. "You will move it to where it was, and then you will move it again. Now work." Such was the life at Trebizond concentration camp. I had been transferred there after a short time mining salt at Waleska. Waleska had been hard, but Trebizond was worse, because at Trebizond the Nazis played games. The Nazis were making us work just to work. This was all a game to them, like a hand of cards or a soccer match. We were the ball to be kicked around for their sport. My arms shook as I picked up the same stone that I had just carried across the compound. But not from weariness this time, from fury. I fumed as I hefted the stone and trudged back across the muddy compound. But they wanted me to be angry. They wanted me to say something, or frown, or mumble curses at them. They were watching me for it, watching all of us, like schoolyard bullies. They wanted to provoke us, and then they would beat us as punishment. At Trebizond, I worked all day moving piles of rocks back and forth, digging holes 6 feet deep, and then filling them back in again. I ate watery broth and weak, old bread once a night and passed out on a wooden pallet with no mattresses or pillows or blankets. I was an animal to them, a pack mule. But beasts were never treated so poorly. Working animals were expensive. They had value. I was a Jew. We were lower than animals. They could kill us, as many of us as they wanted, and there would always be another trainload of us to take our place. But as angry as I was at the Nazis, I was even angrier at my fellow prisoners. How could we take this abuse so quietly, so meekly, with all our heads bowed and a quick tip of the cap to our killers? Yes, the Nazis had clubs and guns, but there were far more of us than there were of them. If we turned on them all at once, we could overcome them. We were not animals to be led to the slaughter. We were thinking, feeling human beings. One day, in the middle of hauling rocks again, I vowed not to be killed without a fight. My father, Uncle Moshe, the Jewish elders, they were all wrong. We shouldn't be trying to survive. We should be trying to win. Instead of waiting for the British or the Americans or the Russians to save us, we should be saving ourselves. I'm not going to let them line me up on the edge of a pit and shoot me, I told myself. I will fight back. I will kick the Nazis in the shins. I will run. I won't go like a sheep to the slaughter. At roll call that night, someone else had the same thought. One of the Nazis struck him with a club, but instead of taking the beating meekly, the prisoner raised his arms and grabbed the stick. He wrestled it from the shocked officer's hands and struck him with it in the head, knocking the Nazi hat into the muck, striking his raised arms again and again. Yes, yes, I thought, it begins here. Together, we can take them all. I looked around anxiously to see if anyone else felt as I did, if anyone else would take up the charge, but everyone had their heads down. No, this was our chance. If we fought together, crack! I jumped at the sound. With the fiery spark of a pistol, it was all over. The prisoner who had fought back crumpled to the ground, dead from a bullet to the brain. And the assaulted officer was hurried away from the assembly grounds. The camp soldiers appeared in force around the edges of our lines, pointing rifles at us, and the camp commandant hurried out from his cozy office. When he heard the report from his officers, he turned on the prisoners. You, he cried, pointing at a boy who had been standing right next to the man who fought back. You were a part of this plot to escape. What? The boy stammered. He wasn't much older than me. No, I didn't even know him. The guards grabbed the boy and dragged him to the front of our lines, where the Nazis had built a gallows for hanging prisoners. And this man, the commandant said, pointing into the crowd, and this one, and him, and him, and him. He was picking people at random, now in his fury, punishing innocent people for the dead man's effrontery. I shrank back. I recognized the boy and two of the other men from my barrack. Like me, they couldn't have known who the dead man was. I'm innocent, the boy my age sobbed as they dragged him up onto the gallows and put the hangman's noose around his neck. I never tried to escape. I promise. I've done everything you asked. I shook with helplessness and rage, but also with fear. This is what fighting back earned you. More abuse, more death. Half a dozen Jews would be murdered today because one man refused to die without a fight. To fight back was to die quickly and to take others with you. This is why our prisoners went meekly to their deaths. I had been so resolved to fight back, but I knew then that I wouldn't. To suffer quietly hurt only you. To suffer loudly, violently, angrily, to fight back, was to bring hurt and pain and death to others. Please, the boy cried. I never tried to escape. I'm innocent. He looked out on all of us, those of us with the courage to look up from the ground. Remember, he begged us, I did nothing. The hangman kicked the chair out from under him, and the boy's body jerked as his neck was broken. I kept my head held high and watched, vowing never to forget. All right, you guys, the Treblinka concentration camp that he was at from 1944. Here's a quote from the story. Our job was to move a pile of rocks. Now, we've seen other pictures like this, but you see the prisoners had no modern conveniences. These are small rocks. But I often think about when he talks about carrying those rocks, how painful it would have been because, you know, it would be painful enough for me and you. We're not malnourished. We have muscle tone and we're healthy. But for somebody who was not healthy, who had, no no muscle tone. So it'd be like, you know how when you hit your shin and there's no muscle on the front of your shin, it's just skin and it hurts really bad. It lasts for a long time. That's kind of what it would be like. It would be very painful because there wouldn't be all that muscle to protect your bones or your skin. It would just be skin on bone. I just think it would be terrible, terribly painful. All right. And this is where he talks about a pack mule. They were treated like pack mules. I know you've seen these on TV. This is a modern version, but when I used to hear stories from my my dad's, not my dad's dad, but older people that would have been the same age as like my grandfather, um, and my dad, even when he was a little boy, they didn't necessarily have a tractor. They couldn't necessarily afford it, but they would use mules and they would use horses to pull plows. And you see the Amish around here all the time doing that kind of stuff. We're kind of used to that, pulling their buggies and things like that. And those animals to them are very valuable. They're worth something. So they were treated well. And I told you that before about like with cattle, with livestock, they're worth something to people. They're a food source, they're a money source. These horses and pack mules were valuable to people. So they took good care of him. This is a metaphor for how he felt. Kicked around like a soccer ball or something like that. Now, when they killed the innocent boy, they were talking about gallows. So this is showing you a gallows that would have worked like him. And you've probably seen these on old Western shows before. But gallows were contraptions used to kill people hanging them by their neck. And the gallows at the left here, well, no, this one, the other left, Miss Thomas, is at Auschwitz concentration camp. It was used after the war to put the Nazi camp commander to death. So the Allies built this to kill the commander who had abused all these people. And Amon Goth was hanged. That's what they did back then. They didn't have an electric chair or a gas chamber or anything like that. And the hangman, in order to not be, I guess, to protect be anonymous, they call it anonymity, he would put something over his head a lot of times, but also a lot of times they would put something over the victim's head, but they didn't afford the Jews this courtesy. And you see he's standing on a stool or a chair of some sort. Well, they would put the rope around his neck short enough that where he couldn't reach the ground without the stool, and then they'd kick the stool out from underneath of it, and the weight of his body would be what would cause his death. Pretty cruel stuff.